Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thanks for stopping by again. Yes, I am working on the neighborhoods video. That got derailed in part because I've had a massive work come in, and this is a totally nonprofit effort that I do here. It's certainly no source of income. And I do have other things I have to do. I have clients and I have colleagues and everybody else who depends on me. And unexpectedly, we just had a burst of work, and I've been really tied up with that. And it really takes time to put together what I want to do for you. But that's happening. A considerable portion of it is done. A little bit more has to be done, and then it has to be put together and edited and put up. So it's coming. But I did want to take a moment to speak on a subject that I consider to be important. And I've often mentioned in the past, in videos and things I've written, that when you're looking at places to live, there is a tendency to look for the one that has the cheapest real estate and the cheapest cost of living and so forth. Although real estate prices are typically what people look at in terms of what they consider to be a country to be less expensive than another. And my comment to them has always been, if prices are much lower in one area than in another, there's a reason for that. And you need to know the reason. The real fact of the matter is that real estate in the internet age has really gone international. People are aware of each other's, other nations and their properties value and so forth in ways that were never the case 20 or 30 years ago. It's not easy to find a successful, stable, growing economy where the prices are really low. Those where they're really low are often those countries that are in the most need, where the people are the poorest, and where the politics and the society may be shakier than they are in others. In fact, they can be quite unstable. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in Latin America in the past century quite often. In this century, not so much at all, but we've had it. And the classic example is Venezuela, which is an absolute disaster. And 10 years ago, it was obviously sliding downhill, even though a lot of people from outside didn't see it. And in great part is because Latin America tends to get ignored. It's not somehow as critical as the Middle East or Asia or one place or another. So a lot can happen here, and people just read what they read in newspapers or whatever. They talk to a few people when they visit. They just don't do the kind of research, and I'm talking about journalists too, and get the attention that they need from publications in North America, Europe, and elsewhere. So Venezuela has been on a long downhill slide. It's a nightmare out there. And we know we have 60, 70,000 of their refugees here in Panama. And there are many more in Colombia and in Brazil because people can walk across the border in those countries, which they can't do here. And it's just a royal mess. Nobody knows what the situation is going to end up. All I can say is that every year we say it can't get much worse, and then it does. So it's anyone's guess as to what the future holds for that nation and its poor people. And well, we hope for their sake that something eventually works out. Now, as far as other nations are concerned that have problems, they are even less likely to be noticed because Venezuela is one of the world's largest oil producers and has the largest oil reserves of any nation in the world. That's something that's not known by a lot of people. They aren't doing a very good job with their oil at the moment for a whole variety of reasons, but they had that resource, and they have a fairly substantial population by Latin American standards. So it's a nation that got some attention. Some of the smaller nations don't get that much attention. In fact, they get less and less of it, actually, as a result of the internet. Because so many nations now are getting attention for all sorts of challenges, good things, bad things, and everything else, that smaller nations just sort of get lost in the shuffle. Panama less so than a lot of countries because we are a critical link in the supply lines that run between Asia and the east coast of the United States and Canada and Brazil. So, if something big happened here, you'll hear about it. It will be in the news because it would disturb people. We have a huge international community here in Panama City, especially in business. Business hates instability. So it's very difficult for us to have a crisis down here without everybody knowing about it. We thankfully don't have them very often. In fact, the last we really had was the Panama Papers, and that wasn't about us. It was really about foreigners who used a law firm here. So we never really saw it as anything benefiting us. More it was benefiting the Prime Minister of Iceland, Vladimir Putin, and so forth. But in any event, the key point is that in a lot of nations, people just don't know. Now, as you also know, if you've been listening to some of my other videos, I don't make a habit of criticizing other nations. It's not worth it. I don't care. I never have cared whether or not any of you come to Panama. That's your decision. You have to go where you need to go. I'm not trying to convince you to come here. I have my feelings about Panama. I'm happy to share them freely. But where you go could be a very different location than I might go to, and that's absolutely reasonable. But I do get concerned about some countries. And Nicaragua is right now a very serious one. Now, for 3 months, this country's been in trouble. It basically boils down to this, is that Daniel Ortega has been in and out of power in Nicaragua for decades. He's a very well-known name in some quarters, and who is currently the president. He was born the same year I was, in 1945, so he's, if he hasn't already, he's turning 73 this year, too. Been around, he's a very experienced man. And I don't happen to agree with him on a lot of issues and how he runs things, but I recognize he has one of the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere. And I mean, really, really poor. And that's a terrific challenge. And he has to find some way to meet people's expectations. And one of those ways was to talk about this Grand Canal that was going to run through Nicaragua, which is dead in the water, is not going anywhere, and nobody's even thinking about that anymore. It's finished. But it was his attempt to try to buck up the spirits of the folks at home. It worked politically for a while until people began to realize how it was going to be done. And in Nicaragua right now, a lot of people think it's still coming, apparently, because there are still protests against it, when in fact there is no movement there, nor are we concerned about it. That's a subject for another day if somebody's really interested, but we don't spend any time at all worrying about a Nicaraguan canal. And right now, certainly nothing to convince us to be otherwise. But he was running out of things to do and to say. But one thing he had that was very positive for him was oil, either free or heavily subsidized, cheaply sold to him from Venezuela and Hugo Chavez and his administration. And so Ortega and Chavez got along extremely well. They helped each other out, and this was a huge benefit to Nicaragua because of its poverty. Well, that's over. Venezuela can't afford to do that any longer. And so the situation has gotten pretty bad in Nicaragua for the government in terms of its finances. And what happened 3 months ago is really relatively simple. They were warned very clearly, their Social Security system, and that's more than just a pension for people who are older. It also has to do with the hospitals, medical care for everybody. It's sort of a general package. And it was on the verge of bankruptcy, just total collapse. So Ortega announced that there would be some increases in the tax that paid into that system, some changes in the way it operated, which would decrease the benefits and so forth. That was going to be protested probably in any nation on earth, but in Nicaragua, much to everyone's surprise, it led to an explosion, and much of it coming from the students in the universities, who had at one time, decades ago, been Ortega's greatest supporters, who are now among his leading, his most vocal critics. But it wasn't just the students. It spread across the country. And it was just rather amazing. Everybody expected that Ortega, after all these years, had enough sense in his head to be able to deal with this without causing the problem to get worse. Well, he didn't. And the result is you get many numbers out there, but the latest statistics and the best sources that I have available to me say at least 300 people have been killed, probably quite a few more. The economy is closing down. Over 90%, their tourist authority, up to nearly 100% of reservations for these summer months or people coming down, they've been canceled, and nobody wants to go there because this situation's out of hand. They have very little business and industry there, but clothing is one of those, and in that particular sector, 70% of the businesses are not operating, and amongst the remaining who are, many are operating as little as 5% of capacity, and the owners are out on Twitter or whatever saying how desperate they are to find cash to pay their workers. And it's just, everything's coming downhill. It's really devastating, and it's very frightening. Now, it's nationwide. It's certainly hitting all the major cities, but it's hitting many of the rural areas as well. I won't go into a lot of detail, but here you have the bottom falling out. And I have brought this to you. I'm talking about this today because I received an email from a retirement wage member in Nicaragua. And I assume he's American. I'm almost certain that he is. But he's a disabled person. He's got a serious problem, and he's truly disabled. He's living on his modest income there. He has his wife. And he's apparently, I assume, was doing quite well. And Nicaragua is a much less expensive country than Panama in some respects, and certainly in some of their areas. And as I say, there's always a reason for it, and he's discovering the reason for it at the moment. She's in a panic, his wife, and he wrote me and said, "Can we come to Panama? I need to bring my dog. I need some personal effects, maybe some furniture items too, and my wife, and come and live in Panama. Just to get a visa up here soon, quickly." And you know, nothing like that happens quickly in any country. And I sat and I talked with the lawyer here about his problem, because I normally don't do that, but here's a man who's beside himself, extremely worried and in a panic. So we did our best to try to come up with as good a solution as we could, but the simple fact of the matter is no. You can't just toss everything in your suitcases and box it up, a bunch of stuff, and grab the dog, and the two of you run down to the airport, get on a plane, and come to Panama to stay. You can come as a tourist, but just the dog alone has to have veterinary certificates. There's a variety of things you have to go through. Everybody does. They bring their pets all the time, but they don't do it overnight. It takes a little planning, a little organization, and you don't get to bring in personal effects duty-free unless you already have specifically the retirement visa that allows for quite a bit to be brought in. But otherwise, you have to pay duty. Certainly, if you just suddenly show up at the airport, it's complicated. So they could come as tourists. Basically, they could pack their suitcases, get in the plane, and come down here and find someone who would take care of the dog for the meantime and the house. And we worked things out, and despite the fact that he was disabled, in Panama, you're supposed to have a health certificate, which is not, you go to a doctor here to get it. It's no big deal. As long as you don't have an infectious disease, they tend to be very generous in this. So I wasn't as concerned about that, because he has nothing about him that's infectious. We were back and forth. I was trying to get information from him so we could talk about it here, what we could do with it, and finally he just went silent. And from the tone of his messages, I think it's a fairly safe bet to say that he realized there was no way he could just come to Panama and live here and just sort of give things up and move out. That it was going to take time, and he did not have that time. Had he continued to write me and express that, I would have suggested to him the best thing probably is to get on the plane and go back to the U.S. But hey, that's not my decision to make. That's up to him. I was very saddened by it, the whole affair, though, and I think of the people who are living down there. There's the city Granada in Nicaragua, which has attracted a lot of expat retirees. Granada is also the scene of trouble, we're told, in this current problem, this collapse of the government, basically. And I have no doubt there's been some violence there. I have no idea if any of it's been directed toward expats. I'm not suggesting it does. I don't know. But it can't be very happy to have this sort of thing going all around you and people up in arms, literally, and using them. What do you do? Do you pack up and go back to your home and leave everything behind, not knowing whether it will be there when you get back? Or do you stay with it and hope that you don't become the center of attention for some violence that's going on? What do you do? And you know, it's not an easy question to answer, even if you have somewhere to go, which will accept you very quickly. You still have everything you've got back there and trouble back there, and you don't know what's happening to it, and you can't really expect anybody else to take care of yours property when they have to focus on taking care of theirs. So that's why I keep encouraging people. If you get a deal, you get some of these international advertising outfits who tell you about how incredibly cheap it is to buy land, buy property there. Get to know the country in advance as best you can. For regular news services, you don't have to go to special websites that tell you the secret truth about a particular country. Anything really important is out there. And you can usually get it in someplace like Google News or Yahoo News or elsewhere, just in general, from across the board from news sites. Something like Nicaragua is there. It can be found, and you can discover what's going on. If you're talking about what to worry about in the future, when you're trying to make a decision when everything seems to be okay in a country, I was asking myself, what would I tell people if they asked me, what are the signs that the country might not be as stable as you want it to be? And one of those is when the president of the country tries to get the Constitution changed so that he can run for re-election, and sometimes re-election indefinitely. That's always a bad sign. That's when the government is all about him, not about any ideology or party or any philosophy, but just about him. That's a very bad sign, and if he gains it, he gets it successfully, and he may be very involved in seeing to it how the vote comes out, keep in mind. That's a bad sign. I don't like it. The second that's very important are what are called paramilitaries. Now, if you're not used to those, how those have worked out in Latin America, and Venezuela is a classic example of this. Hugo Chavez at one point was not sure he had the armed forces solid support. They were trying to remain independent as they're supposed to in a democracy. And so he armed large groups, many small groups, of farmers, of workers, and so on, that were very closely tied to his political party and to him and what he was offering. And, I mean, his most enthusiastic supporters. And he gave them guns, gave them weapons, that is, ammunition, and some limited training, and the sense of being part of a sort of semi-military unit to help defend the revolution should the need ever arise. Now, that's a paramilitary. It's not really a military, and it does not have, they don't have the training, and they don't have the chain of command, they don't have the discipline and so forth, and they're not part of the constitutional system, and so on and on and on. They're guys with guns, and they can use them when they think there's something going wrong. And if the president feels he's in trouble, he might be losing control, he may give them the sign, to get out there and straighten these protesters out. And this is basically what's going on, in great part, in Nicaragua right now. The paramilitaries, supportive of Ortega, and they're doing the shooting, and they're predominantly responsible for the deaths that are coming out of that particular disaster. Paramilitaries have been part of many Latin American nations for years, and some come from the government in power, some are put together independently, but I don't like the word paramilitary. And if I'm in a country with paramilitaries are considered, that's P-A-R-A hyphen military, if I know that they're common, this is not a place I want to live. It shows a lack of organization, a lack of internal discipline, and some very suspicious reasons. At least I'm always suspicious of why do we have to have paramilitaries when we have a military and a police force? We shouldn't need those, should we? There's a reason for that, and I don't like it. So Venezuela had it, Nicaragua's had it, and they're active right now. And that alone, that plus, well, the very great poverty that Nicaragua is in, and Daniel Ortega's shaky background or whatever, there are a lot of reasons why I never looked at Nicaragua. But there's been at least one of the international retiree sort of groups that has been pushing Nicaragua for years because they own land there and they're selling it. And they have been, at least in the past. And it is like so many Latin American nations. It has beautiful towns, they have beautiful churches. Because modernization has not come, because money has not come in, many of the communities have that old flavor, and it's really very, very nice. It's beautiful. But it masks poverty, great poverty, in many instances. Not always, but it does in countries like Nicaragua. So it's charming, and it's a great place to visit, a great place to vacation. Until such time as there's trouble, as there is now, and then suddenly nobody wants to be there for vacation, but the people who moved in there to live are stuck. And they have to make some very difficult decisions in a very short period of time. I don't think most of you want to do that. So keep your eye open for presidents for life and for paramilitaries and things of this sort. And in most of the news about these countries, it can be found, and it can be found in just standard news sources. You can pick up on this. Sometimes the Wikipedia pages offer you some good ideas, knowledge, but they're often out of date too. Like in Nicaragua, they may not be up to date at all on that set of circumstances because it's still unfolding. So that's why I decided I just go ahead and do one video today and just share that with you and tell you that this is an important thought to keep in mind. Most of Latin America has straightened out immensely. I mean, Peru is so much safer than it used to be, and it's so much, its economy has been much more successful in the past. Argentina seems to be turning itself around. Ecuador was an area that I was concerned about because of its ties and the way in which its politics were going, its ties to Hugo Chavez, and the way its politics were headed. But that's turned around, and it's pulling its act together. Chile, of course, is a wonderful country, and so on and so forth. Colombia is trying. Colombia is divided sharply, and they still have paramilitaries here and there, I guess. I don't know, but they certainly have cartels, and those have not yet gone away. So it's a difficult set of circumstances in some countries, but on the whole, Colombia has really improved its situation over the last decade. And there are countries like Venezuela, and now Nicaragua, which is a mini Venezuela, in essence, that if you focus on them and think that represents Latin America, you're wrong. It might have been representative of much of Latin America in the 20th century, at least during certain periods of the 20th century, but not this century. And I think you're seeing the dying gasp of that kind of government. It just isn't, things are changing. Things are changing. And Panama, we're not concerned about that sort of activity at all. Our presidents can't run for re-election, and that's that. And one attempted to have the Constitution changed to allow him to run again, and it got overwhelmingly defeated. So no one's even talking about doing that anymore. And we don't have paramilitaries. We don't have a military. We don't need it. Our police force does very well. So, and they're good folks. So as a result, we don't worry about it. And Costa Rica doesn't worry about that sort of stuff. But some countries do, and especially the Central American countries, it's a bigger concern. So keep it in mind, and just be warned, and keep an eye on Nicaragua, because there's the hope for these people that they can turn it around, that somehow Ortega comes to his senses and does something to make the situation better, instead of continuing to fight it. Too many people dead already. So that's it. I'm sorry to have to bring that sort of bad news to your attention, but it's summer in North America, and some people come down during these months, and this is when they're looking around. You need to be aware of this sort of thing when it does go on. And this is a particularly bad situation right this minute, so I'm sharing it with you. That's all. God bless Nicaragua, and God bless you all, and thanks for stopping by. I look forward to seeing you again.